Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points. We use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. And as always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us this week in Bulgaria. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, we recognize that this is the first episode in the month of August. Yeah, we thought we would try dedicating the next several episodes to those country segments that we sometimes do. You know, obviously summer is a time of travel, so we thought we'd travel the world a bit ourselves, stopping at some countries that are in the news, some countries that are not in the news. And so, yeah, stick with us in the weeks ahead. We'll probably be covering China, for example, but also some out-of-the-way countries like Bulgaria, where Adam is right now. This week, we thought we'd also do something more in the news, and the data point there is $522.03 billion US dollars. That was the GDP of Israel in 2022, which amounts to about $54,600 per capita, given Israel's total population of about 9 million. That makes Israel about the 28th largest economy in the world. But that economic success seems to have been put at risk, perhaps, by the current Israeli government, which is a coalition of conservatives and far-right parties led by Benjamin Netanyahu. They recently passed legislation weakening the country's judiciary,
specifically approving a provision that stops judges from striking down government decisions that they find unreasonable. Now, this vote...
And that has set off unprecedented protests across Israeli society, including from the country's economic elites that have helped make the country so wealthy.
Thousands of protesters gathered here in front of Israel's parliament, and there was a cry of kind of anger and despair as the news reached the crowd.
And that's made the current controversies a test of the circumstances under which politics can have an effect on the economy in general. It's also raised questions of why exactly Israel is so successful in the first place. So we thought we'd try to unpack Israel's economy in general. Yeah, Adam, I thought we could start with some data. Israel is considered a high-income country. Its GDP ranks it number 13 in the world. It's also a country that has spent quite a bit of money on defense over the years. So how did Israel exactly become so rich? I mean, from a historical perspective, does Israel's economic success trace back to its socialist ideology? Or is it really the liberalization policies of the 80s and 90s that, you know, popular literature has focused on? Is it those reforms that played a decisive role?
Yeah, I think there's a real issue of perspective here because the hype around the Israeli economy since the so-called reform, some people even refer to it as the transition period of the 80s and the 90s, where it supposedly cast off its socialist origins, has been so intense that it's, I think, completely distorted the country's economic history. I mean, you'd think that, Israel in the early 70s was a poor socialist country. I mean, if it was socialist at all, it was social democratic, and its GDP per capita measured in purchasing power parity terms according to a common, historical baseline was basically at the same level as Italy's in 1973. It was only marginally below that of the United Kingdom, which, considering where Palestine started out in the 1940s, was an absolutely spectacular growth achievement. I mean, Israel in its current form would simply not exist without that first phase of social democratic, socialist, kibbutz-anchored version of the Israeli project. It literally wouldn't exist. The entire society in its modern shape, city of Tel Aviv, for instance, all of the major areas of urban settlement are products of that first phase. And the growth rate was absolutely spectacular, as those numbers suggest, over 10% per annum. So the whole idea that somehow Israel needed to escape the cocoon of the crippling fetters of socialism so as to achieve its potential is just silly. And considering it, this is an idea widely espoused by people who fancy themselves as tech geniuses. It smacks of a peculiar lack of basic arithmetic sense, in that if you grow at, a growth rate of 4 or 5% per annum, which is what Israel has been achieving at high pace in the 1980s, since the 1980s, you actually do end up where Israel has ended up, which is now as a very high income country, not at the level of the United States, but nevertheless one of the top tier rich countries in the world. That doesn't take a miracle. It just all it does is require a kind of continuation of exponential growth rates. The shock of the 70s in Israel was very intense, 70s and early 80s. And of course, it was intense everywhere, pretty much. There's very few countries which escape a nasty 1970s. You've got the oil crisis. You've got the end of the easy phase of growth where you could just urbanize, modernize your agricultural system, which is what the Israelis famously did, and do basic industrialization, which they also did. So all of those options expire. Then you have quite commonly political economy issues, so struggles between employers and trade unions, backed in various ways by governments, which Israel has in spades. It has a famous, system of wage indexation by the early 1980s. But the really significant thing, of course, that happens to Israel between 67 and the early 1980s is a period of really large-scale warfare, which Israel wins in 67, then struggles really to survive in 73, struggles for a kind of peace deal, which it achieves in 79, then has a major military incursion in Lebanon. And it's really only when that begins to unwind that the Israeli economy can stabilize, because defense spending goes from the 5 to 10% of GDP, which it was at in the early 60s, to 30% of GDP by 1980. And you cannot stabilize or run a stable growth regime with that kind of share of military spending, which is where it maxed out and then progressively came down. And so what we're really looking at is a peculiar instance of a fairly typical gear shift from rapid post-World War II growth to much more slow and contested and inflationary growth in the 70s and early 1980s, compounded by Israel's peculiar problems, followed by, in the Israeli case, a relatively successful, what you'd call neoliberal, market-driven growth from the late 80s, early 90s onwards. But as in everywhere else, that's actually slower than the period of the 50s and the 60s. And as in most countries, it's actually slower than it was in the 1970s, because in real economic terms, the Israeli economy grew relatively rapidly in the 70s and early 80s, unsurprisingly, given the huge amount of fiscal stimulus it was receiving. The problem was inflation, and they tackled that in the mid-1980s with the famous stabilization program, which Stanley Fischer put through. The kind of apple of the modern Israeli neoliberal market-driven story is the tech sector. That's the apple in the eye. This is the real jewel in the crown. And it is a large tech sector by global standards, and Israel does have an exceptionally high R&D share as a share of GDP. It's up at South Korea's level in the 4 to 5% of GDP. So these are really striking numbers. But again, if you ask what's supercharging this extraordinary burst of research and development, it's the university system, which is one of the proudest legacies of that earlier period of social democratic Israeli state building in the post-war period. And if you look at the human factor that's added in, that an absolutely crucial factor is the flow of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people from the ex-former Soviet Union in the early 1990s, who came with extraordinary high levels of education provided by another socialist regime, in this case the Soviet Union, which had extremely good technical and maths education, of which the Jewish minority took ample advantage. And so really, you could say that it's a kind of ideal case of neoliberal stabilization gone right in the 1980s, an influx, by all means, of various types of venture capital from the 90s and early 2000s onwards, though the original venture capital firm in the Israeli case was a government-backed entity, which was then privatized, with an exceptional endowment of human capital, much of it provided by public education in Israel. So, it's a really interesting fact that this story is so often told as one of a kind of the need to overcome state control and interference so as to release growth. I think it's much better thought of perhaps as sort of stages of a rocket, like where you have the heavy lift being done by the social democratic phase. And then once you're comfortably in high to middle income range, then you can dispense with some of that, possibly at a price, hugely increased inequality, but nevertheless still continue at least a modest rate of growth in a different regime into the 90s, 2000s, and down to the present day.
I wonder if there's another wrinkle to the state-led development history that you're describing there, in the sense of whether the military itself played a role in incubating talent and driving technology. I mean, is that a sign of flip side to this development story that you were describing?
Well, to an extent, though, on the whole, you'd think of the military as a tax on human capital. The more that men and women have to spend time, learning to fire weapons, the less time they're spending on innovation they could otherwise be doing. There's no doubt that this adds very significant pressure to the Israeli high-tech efforts in two dimensions. First, in the phase between 1967 and the early 1980s, when the Israeli military-industrial complex comes under huge pressure because the French abruptly end their intense collaboration with Israel that had enabled the Israeli military-industrial complex to take off in the 50s and 60s, and that ends abruptly in 1967. And so then the Israelis have to nationalize quite a lot of their military-industrial development. And then on the flip side of that, then the running down of major military-industrial projects from the mid-1980s onwards. They cancelled a national fighter jet program. That, in a sense, releases an expanded core of military-industrial expertise into the free market from the late 80s, early 90s onwards. Now, I mean, there's a lot of news stories, you can read them everywhere, of the intense collaboration between Israeli tech firms and the surveillance apparatus they've erected in the occupied territories. I think that's a fascinating and alarming story, especially given the global sale of the technology the Israeli firms are developing. But it's hard to say whether it really amounts to a significant share of the growth story. Altogether, it's very easy to exaggerate the significance of high-tech stories in aggregate economic growth. They're often very difficult to find, as Robert Solow, the famous MIT economist, pointed out. They're often rather difficult to find in the GDP data, and Israel is no exception.
So I wanted to shift to the U.S. perspective, because when the United States tends to think about the Israeli economy, I think the issue that gets the most attention for most people is the foreign aid that the United States provides to Israel, which is more than to any other country in the world. It's up to about $3.8 billion a year right now. People in the U.S. often question the policy of providing all that aid to Israel, given the strength of its economy that we were just describing. But how much of an impact does that aid really have on Israel in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are dramatic. I think it's probably worth saying that right now, unless I'm missing something, US support for Ukraine is substantially larger. And Israel is, in fact, often cited as an example of where the United States might be headed in its relationship with Ukraine, outside NATO, but nevertheless an essential security policy partner. But yes, if you add up the figures in inflation-adjusted terms over the lifetime of the Israeli state, it's probably about $300 billion in total that have been transferred from the American taxpayer to Israel. Of course, a lot of that flows back because the money is tied to arms purchases by the Israelis in the United States. And that takes us back to this point about 1967, because up to 1967, France was the major supplier of weapons to Israel. And after 1967, when the French cut off the supply lines and the Israelis have scored this extraordinary success in the 1967 war, that's really when American aid comes to the fore. And particularly after the panic stations moment in 1973, when it looks as though Israel might actually lose. And there's this huge surge of domestic Israeli military spending and American assistance to Israel, which tops out at a figure which was completely blew my mind when I was looking at it. In the early 1980s, there's a single period, and I think it has to do with the fact that the Americans are actually building a base in Israel, where American assistance to Israel hits like over 20% of Israeli GDP, which is really a staggering figure. It is very brief, and then it comes back down again. And now American aid to Israel is only in the level of about 1% of GDP, or about a fifth of Israeli defense spending. So it's considerable, but it's not decisive. The Israelis could clearly do it themselves, and it's particularly, as it were, sort of a question mark, I think, for the Israelis, because it is tied to the requirement to spend money on American weapons, so the money flows back. And to that extent, as with all aid of this type, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because the more money you take from the Americans, the less you spend on your own military, right? So if you're buying, so in a sense, like if you're buying your fighter jets from the Americans, you're not developing your own. And the Israeli ambition in the early age was to acquire famously steel, French technology, and then adapt it and make their own aircraft. And they've largely moved away from doing that. So there's a displacement effect, a kind of, you might call it like a Dutch disease. But obviously the Israelis still have a formidable military industrial establishment of their own. 1% of GDP is where we're at. That's the kind of ballpark.
So let's talk about the occupation of the West Bank. Israel obviously maintains military rule over millions of Palestinians, and servicing that occupation costs money. So does building settlements for Jews in the West Bank and incentivizing people to live there with tax benefits, etc., that kind of thing. But Israel also profits from the occupation in direct and indirect ways. It benefits from mining and other forms of extraction. I guess you could argue that the settlements even help moderate housing prices throughout Israel by providing more space, more housing for Jews. So how should we think about the occupation from an economic standpoint? Does Israel's occupation pass any kind of cost-benefit analysis? And what kind of insight can the history of colonialism lend to this kind of policy? Under what conditions can occupation work at all as an economic policy?
Well, I think it is fair to say that from an economic point of view, the entire Israeli project is a highly successful settler colonial project. It's one of the last in the 20th century. It's unusual in that the settler population establishes a decisive majority within the territory. And though it expels a large part of the Palestinian population, a substantial fraction remains. On the other hand, it's not South Africa, where the majority is, in that case, of course, black, and the whites constitute a minority population. So it's an unusual balance. Currently, the settler population, the Jewish settler population, in relation to the Jewish population of Israel, is about 10%. So it's a non-trivial fraction. It's hard to see, Cam, that it constitutes a substantial relief. I mean, I find it hard to imagine that this is a substantial relief valve on the real estate situation in Israel. Maybe you've seen other arguments. Clearly, expanding space does that, but this is really an ideologically led project. I mean, in some sense, Zionism was always, of course, a blend of ideology with a pragmatic politics of actual state making and society making, and so the two have always been entwined. But in the case of the settlers in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, I mean, it's emphatically an ideologically driven program first. But that doesn't mean that economic interests aren't entangled with it. I mean, critically on the ground, of course, systematically favoring Israeli settlers over the local Palestinian population. And that's really where I think the economics of this just breaks down entirely, because the net effect of the program is obviously to devastate to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year what could be thriving mixed Arab-Israeli, Palestinian-Israeli communities that could have dense and highly successful and prosperous commercial interactions, and instead reduced to a state of appalling guerrilla warfare with violence on both sides, and systematic and hugely asymmetric violence, of course, and massive systematic discrimination against the Palestinian communities which are trying to make a living for themselves, and in many cases reduced to just outright poverty. So we're really talking about an econicidal kind of project of destruction, in many cases quite deliberately so as to undermine the viability of the Palestinian communities and stabilize the grip of the Jewish settlers who claim this as Eretz Israel, as the land biblically promised to them. So at this point, I think, when you're in that kind of territory, analysis in terms of economics is about tactics, is about how a settler population secures itself. It's not really about the underlying motive. And that's also felt by the Israeli population, which has to fund this and does fund this to a considerable extent. This isn't to say the settlers don't generate economic output. Of course they do, but the question is like, does it pay for itself? And the answer is not in the way that other projects do. This is one area in which the Israeli state continues to engage in very heavy subsidy. What's really striking is the recent moves by Israel to if you like, overcome the huge economic damage that supporting the settler project does to its relations with its neighboring Arab states, all of which should be leading trading partners of Israel and can't be, given the way in which the current government is behaving in the occupied territories. But nevertheless, through the Abraham Accords, Israel is finding the possibility of new partnerships with truly economically potent Arab counterparts, notably the UAE, which has gone in with Israel in its very promising Eastern Mediterranean gas developments, and according to the UAE side, sees a huge surge in bilateral trade between Israel and the UAE, extending out to about $10 billion by 2030. So there are players out there that Israel can find to offset what is otherwise, in economic terms, both an expensive strategy for Israel and a ruinous strategy for its relations with its Arab neighbors, and devastating for the Palestinian population in the occupied territories themselves.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, and we'll be back in a second to talk more about the economy of Israel and specifically the impact of the government's judicial overhaul. Okay, we are back. So let's now talk about the changes that Netanyahu's government is trying to impose on the judicial system that I mentioned. Essentially, his government wants to limit the powers of the Supreme Court quite dramatically, and as a result, many thousands of Israelis are protesting each week. But it's not only that. High-tech companies are pulling out of the country. Moody's has warned investors of significant economic risk as a result of that. And I'm wondering just how much damage this legislation could do to the Israeli economy. I mean, can we look at, say, Hungary or Poland, where there's been a similar lurch towards authoritarianism, and draw some useful comparisons? Or is Israel especially dependent, more so than those other countries, on foreign investment and therefore more vulnerable to these kinds of shifts that are threatening to happen?
I mean, Israel does have a relatively high foreign direct investment share. The numbers I've seen put it at about 4% of GDP, which is much higher than the average, but not overwhelmingly high. Significant, but not overwhelming. I think the comparisons with Hungary and Poland cause one to be, on the whole, relatively, assuming one sides with the protesters against the Netanyahu's measures, they make one feel relatively pessimistic about the likely long-run leverage of international capital, because despite the evident trend in both Hungarian and Polish politics, there has been no shortage of foreign investors willing to pile money into those countries, very little obvious sign of any desire to pull out. And that goes also for, even more egregious and intense and serious cases like China, where as well we have seen a real stickiness of investment once it goes in. Now, it's possible that the particular valence of the Arab-Israeli, the Palestinian issue, has a different character. But on the whole, you would say that what is sometimes called democratic backsliding, which is a rather kind of normative and teleological way of looking at this, but it hasn't on the whole, led to massive investor strikes, which have caused a serious rethink of the policies of any of the major protagonists. In fact, on the whole, they've benefited from really complacent foreign investment. So, and people say, well, the tech ecosystem of Israel can be duplicated elsewhere. I mean, that may be true up to a point, but in practice, also, those systems are quite sticky. And I wouldn't be that optimistic that you could actually, those kind of clusters of intensely, expert communities are, in fact, quite difficult to move. So, you can see the kind of, the liberal excitement around this, and it's a familiar story, and we've seen it over and over again. I'm not sure it fills me with any great optimism, but and certainly, if one thinks about Brexit, for instance, the timeline can be quite slow. Certainly too slow to make much difference to the politics, which runs rampant and goes on a rampage. And then it takes 5 years, 10 years for the impact on investment to be felt, by which point it's just basically pain compounding the political damage that's being done rather than an economic weapon, if you like, that causes an adjustment in politics.
Yeah, that does sound rather more pessimistic, but yeah, maybe also just more realistic when it comes to the calculations made by investors. Finally, I guess I wanted to ask about the protests. It does seem that they are being led by the economic elites in any case in Israel. Generally the more educated, the higher income earners. Many of these Israelis have second passports, and you hear, at least anecdotally, a lot of people talking about leaving the country entirely as a result of these political shifts. That could cause, in theory, a brain drain of some proportion, but that got me wondering, are brain drains even real? I mean, what percentage of a country's upper echelon would need to leave for it to have a real impact on the economy, and is that even conceivable in the Israeli case right now?
I mean, I think brain drains are real. Being a second generation brain drainer, so they are real. Whether or not they do damage, to the GDP level, I think is a more open question. And this question really is interesting. I didn't know this, but Israel actually had punitive taxation in place through to the early 60s to prevent emigration, and are very coy about publishing emigration data. So the data that we have on the number of Israelis living outside the country is as far as I'm able to tell. I mean, I think the consensus figure is about 700,000, but they keep much closer tabs on the Aliyah, so called, as it were, the movement of Jews back. What a phrase! Like, what is the appropriate non-teleological, non-Zionist phrasing of this? Like, the movement of Jewish people to Israel, I guess, is the neutral way of formulating that. And those data show a very considerable shift in the balance, apparently, in the last 12 months, with two offsetting effects: a reduction in the flow of Jewish people from almost everywhere in the world to Israel, with one exception, and that's Russia. In fact, I know colleagues who have fled Russia to Israel in the last 12 months to escape the horror of the escalating repression of Putin's regime and the war. I think there's an interesting. It is truly striking to see, and again, there are analogies to moments like Brexit, or Trump for that matter, the degree to which elites, not just economic, but I mean, perhaps most strikingly, the military elite, are voicing and articulating their opposition. There's another thing, though, about elites, which is quite interesting and really took me aback when I dug into this, which is they tend to be on the older side, because you don't get to be powerful until you're generally speaking, till you're in middle age or older. And what this exposes is that there's apparently a really stark difference in the age, across ages in Israel, on the issue of nationalism and, willingness to believe in a two-state solution and so on. And it's the older Israelis who are actually more liberal and more inclined to cling to the idea, the older ideas of a peace settlement, whereas 73% of Israelis between the ages of 18 and 24 self-identify as right-wing. 73%. Whereas only 46% of Israelis, Jewish Israelis this is, in both cases, over 65 do. And there's a similar disparity on the two-state solution. So young Israelis are very pessimistic about it, and sort of a bare majority of older Israelis believe in it. And that's really, I thought, quite staggering. And it isn't explained in terms of the demographic factor, in that the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox have more children. It's partly explained by that, but that's not enough to fully account for this. So you could almost think of these protests. I mean, this may do a complete injustice to them, and to be honest, I found it quite difficult to find data on the socio economic composition of the protesters. But and I know many, I'm now in the older generation, but I know younger people who've protested too. But this is something really, I thought, really took me aback that the younger generations, who are presumably better educated than their parents and grandparents, are actually more right-wing and more inclined, therefore, one presumes, I guess, to support the positions of this government.
Interesting. I mean, one thing I found remarkable, and perhaps this is related to this point, is that it seems like the protesters have been at pains not to suggest that they're coming from the left. I mean, they have embraced, the symbol is the Israeli flag. It sort of seems to be trying to create a message that their opposition is not being motivated by liberal or leftist ideas.
Yeah, no, it's adherence to the values of the state, isn't it? The military statement was really striking on this, that they were willing to sacrifice their lives and their souls, right, for the Israeli state, but not for this, not for a dictatorship, as they put it. So, really an extraordinary disjuncture here, in a state which for a long time really was perhaps the single most dramatic instance of a state whose legitimacy was anchored in a civic religion, an explicitly secular, but in a sense religiously infused patriotism. To be faced with this kind of crisis, it's really very dramatic.
Well, I think we have to leave the conversation here for now, but I think we covered a lot of ground, from the protests to the entire history of Israel. Yeah, perhaps we'll have occasion to return to the subject at some point. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.